Greetings and welcome to another installation of the AfricanAmerican Legacy Preaching Series founded by Dr. Frank Thomas. I'm your host, Dr. Courtney Buggs, Director of the PhD program in AfricanAmerican Preaching and Sacred Rhetoric here at Christian Theological Seminary. It is my pleasure to be here today with my colleague and my friend, Dean Kenyatta Gilbert, the Dean of Howard University Divinity School and Professor of Homiletics. Welcome to the Legacy Preaching Series.
Well, thank you, my friend. It's so great to see you, Dr. Buggs.
Wonderful, wonderful. We are going to have a conversation today about Dean Gilbert's trajectory in preaching as well as his trajectory in the academy. So I want to ask you to introduce yourself to our viewers and tell us about your ministry journey.
Okay, I think I can do that. So again, I am a native of the great state of Texas. I am the son of a preacher and son of an educator. I have reached almost the half-century point of my life. I will be 50 in August. I am the youngest of my siblings, and some say I act that way, whatever that means. But I grew up in the house of a pastor whose life was in many ways afflicted with disability, and from the earliest point of my recollections of sort of his ministry was while he was walking on crutches, or ultimately, as his health deteriorated, having been a wheelchair-bound person. And so early on, I sort of learned that my ministry life would take a course that would require that I'd have a sense of compassion for those who are either afflicted through health or whatever challenge, but also paying attention to the ways in which we can be humbled by ministry, and even ourselves carry certain burdens and suffering that lead us in our journey. And so I sort of construct that in a way to frame sort of how I think about my life biographically. When I was, I guess, about 9 years old, I started to feel a sense of, well, you're sort of different. You're not quite, like your friends. I don't know if it was because I was in the clergy fishbowl, and realized that, early on, some of the spotlight would be a part of my legacy, if you will. And it created, I think, in some ways, some anxiety around what it means to be a public presence in the world. And to be quite honest, I never really got comfortable with sort of navigating things without seeking spiritual attunement in order to sort of work my way and make my way through ministry. I can say that my earliest recollection of preaching came at the Carver Park Baptist Church, which is where my father pastored some 15 years until, again, his health began to fail. And in Texas culture, it's not uncommon for the minister to sermonize and then sing, right? And so I admired him and others in the city greatly who were able to sing and preach. And so there was a certain way of doing proclamation that informed my own sensibilities about what I would and would not do. And I recognized very early that preaching was something that I had no desire to do. And so I'm by nature, I think, a reluctant, observant person, not wanting to put myself out there unless I feel a lot more prepared than, well, if I didn't feel prepared, I would be less inclined to take the risk of any public presentation. And so very early on, I knew that much would be expected of me, but also that I needed to really sort of take myself out of the equation and allow the Spirit of grace to manifest in me so that I could do what ultimately I felt God was calling me to do.
So can you talk about how you navigated those feelings of hesitancy, and do they continue even now, years in ministry, how you navigate those moments of perhaps, can I really do this? Should I really do this?
Right. Well, over time, I became a little more conscientious about how spiritual attunement and discipline have to be wed in order for one to do this kind of work. And so I've never felt fully confident that what I would do or how I would perform would be adequate for what I believe preaching requires. The gravity of what it means to preach well had a lot more to do with the performative aspect of preaching, which in some ways I can recall quite vividly the painstaking amount of preparation I put into my first sermon when I was licensed. I had already established myself on my college campus as a leader, led a Bible study. I did quite a few things. I was a chaplain in my choir. I was a leader in my fraternity. All of these things sort of prepared me for leadership, but not that sort of leadership where it requires monological kind of expertise in order to engage the listener. And so all eyes on me has been the course, I guess, if you will, of how I have, from the origins of my development as a preacher, I've felt that more than I have felt the community's sort of involvement in my shaping. So what that means as well for me is you sort of never really get comfortable if your path is so unique and distinctive that you sort of, by trial and error, sort of open up yourself to, well, you know what, I'll try this. I'll try this and see whether or not it proves to be a faithful way of engaging ministry. I say all of that because early on in my college life, my father passed. And so at his passing, I knew that a level of responsibility would be placed on me, not necessarily being a minister. That's something I think I discerned over time. And my father was not the type of clergy person who expected, or at least intimated, that you're going to be a part of a preaching legacy. No, that was not the way in which things went down in my house. And so coming to the conclusion that that which would free me most would be yielding to something that felt greater than myself. And I entrusted myself to the stewardship responsibility of preparing for ministry. Again, as I've stated several times, that in my cradle community, having a formal theological education was not a prerequisite for fitness for ministry. And but I knew, just as I had hoped to enter politics and go to law school, I knew that that required a certain level of preparation. Why not ministry? And so, having attended Baylor University, which is the world's largest Baptist university, having done that, and shifted from, well, as a poli-sci, I was a poli-sci major, and then I minored in religion. My leanings toward my religion courses gave me sort of a clear awareness that what it takes to do ministry will require more than praying and singing, right? Okay. So the sort of hybrid development of being interested in social justice very early on and civic engagement, but also thinking about, okay, what does this mean? How do you pair this with ecclesial ministry? My father became that model for me. He was very active in Waco civic life, was on the school board, not just a local pastor, but also extremely engaged with the hiring commission, Upward Bound, all of these things that sort of tied ministry and education and justice. And that was, I believe, unconsciously a critical part of my formation as a minister, as a preacher. What can I say about other influences early on? Well, my church from birth really gave me the kind of encouragement that one would not expect in other places or other segments of the society. Okay. And because of the love, the support, the financial support, and the wisdom that I received from so many in that community, who today, those who have not made transition, who today continue to support and encourage me. They're proud of me, and of course, no one wants to let their people down. But I'd gotten also to a point in my life where I believed that my true audience was an audience of one, right? One can spend the balance of one's life trying to please people, right? And to try to perfect things that sometimes just is basically an offering, right? You do your best. You give God what you can. And I believe we are met by the divine, and the divine gives us inspiration to move beyond our own human capacities. And so the journey has been interesting, book worthy, yes. Just because I think the way in which I came to ministry and how the journey has been such an adventure, filled with mystery, filled with adversity in some ways, but also filled with a sense of abiding support and love.
I think it's beautiful the way you describe this community that has just kind of nurtured you, continues to nurture you, and the significance of that. I wonder if you can talk about your call, not just in ministry, but then this call to this vocational life in the academy, and how that came to be.
Right. Well, for me, I, like many preachers who attend seminary, you sort of have several things on your mind. Mm-hmm. Will I meet my spouse, right? What church will I be called to? Mm-hmm. And in my case, I had a pretty good GPA. I'd gone to the flagship seminary of the Presbyterian Church. Some ways in the back of my mind, I felt entitled mm-hmm. to a church to serve, mm-hmm. right? But the closer I got to graduation, the more fearful and anxious I got, because no one called, no one knocked and said, we want you. Mm-hmm. It became a test of my faith, because it met my spouse while in seminary, and had to make some personal decisions about whether I would reside where we were in New Jersey, or whether I'd relocate back to my native state. And it became, sort of another discernment process, because it just didn't turn out the way mm-hmm. that I'd planned, mm-hmm. right? But when I consider it all in its totality, I know that this journey has been God ordained, and I think it's significant to look back and to develop a sense of, you didn't make this by yourself, and you didn't. You needed grace. You have, as many, you have a certain amount of gift to do what you hope to do, and to do it well. But in some ways, it takes more of an openness to one who companions with you along that journey. And for me, it has been the Spirit of God. And it has been also the encouragement of people. I think, to that point, I think our society does us a disservice, at least in the American context, when the way in which folks tend to connect successful ministry, it focuses on the individual. Mm-hmm. And so that sense of loss of the communitarian ethos that really makes impressions that are formative, when that is not honored, or when that is not deemed highly significant, then I think we often do things that are self-serving. Mm-hmm. We become a little more absorbed. We find ourselves in more of a lonely place, because as we ascend in ways where folks may describe it as being successful, often it creates a sort of despair, if you will, if you have not understood that ministry calls us not away from folk per se, unless you're a monastic or of some sort, but it does call us into community, right? And from my perspective, to do the work that we do requires that we're accountable for what we say, but also to whom we preach.
So I want to just stay right there for a minute and shift to you in the classroom.
Right.
and how you bring this idea of community to the homiletics classroom. Often people come into the classroom, as you say, very self-centered, and visions of who they might be, and not disputing who we might be. But I wonder how you bring this sense of community and the importance of community into the preaching classroom.
No, that's a great question. When I think about what it means for folk to come into a classroom having already arrived, if you will, I never really take it upon myself to diminish their ego. I think it just happens over time, because there is a point in the seminary classroom where folks who are exposed to something different, they understand method in a different way, their over-reliance on their own oratory and charismatic gifts become a little more, it becomes a little more humbling when you are theologically stretched. One of the things that I think was helpful but also terrifying when I attended seminary was that I had to preach in a highly sterile environment. I was used to hearing preaching that was antiphonal. Folks were, sort of engaged in call and response, and one could establish rhythm in the preaching moment. Not so in the classroom. I'd have a few amens, every now and then, but
maybe,
right?
Right.
But there was a different sort of listening that took place in that classroom that made me want to pay attention to the literary pieces and the way in which I communicated who God is before the people. I knew that I had to figure out a way to get my theology, in alignment with my own faith tradition, and push against that when I could not understand, well, why do I believe this? And so I've met many a student who comes to the classroom having been formed that way. And so by the time they come to me, there's sort of a process of deconstruction that is already taking place. They have had their Bible courses, they've had theology, and they've been exposed to church history and things of that sort. And so when they come to me, I'm helping them to reconstruct something that they may or may not welcome, right? And so that's the place where I find things most rewarding, because the light bulb comes on and students are now accountable for what they believe in a way in which they previously were not. And so the professorial life has been rich for me. Teaching in a historically Black theological institution, that particular context, as the sole homiletician, over the course of 17 years, has allowed me to use that space as a case study environment, but also to develop my own scholarship, right? Without having to adhere to someone else's standardized methodology that I would have been encouraged just to embrace without any critical analysis or examination of whether or not it fits for the people that I would be called to serve.
Yeah, so let's talk about that scholarship. Wonderful writer, and so I'll start with the journey and promise of African-American preaching, and you can take us through some of the other texts, but I'd like you to talk about kind of the impetus behind that, and how even your work at Howard helped inform some of the ideas that show up in your work?
Right. No, that's an excellent question. I think at heart, I appreciate method, and I appreciate writing. Even in my first sermon, as I think about it, I was never really an off manuscript preacher. I always thought that sort of an organized way of giving a message landed better for me, because it freed me to do, preach in the way in which, I feel most free, right? And so in the classroom, I seek to sort of encourage folks to do that. If you have to write a manuscript, whether you take it to the pulpit or not, that's on you.
Yes.
You still, and even though preaching is highly subjective, you're going to be graded.
Yes.
And so for me, I had to early on establish methodology, homiletical methodology that would be socioculturally alert to sort of the communities that form the preacher, had to be theologically faithful to both text and one's own spiritual awareness of who God is in their life. It had to be appropriate to the historical moment, right? So is our preaching historically relevant for the time in which we have been given? And so being able to sort of write a work on African-American preaching without making it a generic, non-culturally particular volume was sort of my mindset when I began to write. I stayed in my doctoral program longer than I wanted to. I felt hazed in some ways because it was a very uneven journey for a number of reasons. And over the course of that period, I could sort of mark the births of my children. I could mark certain things based on sort of how things unfolded in my life, right? But when I finished my program, I had much more in the writing corpus than what I had imagined that I had. And so even though I'd taken a position as a assistant professor at Howard, which in some ways is a very teaching intensive place, however, holding the expectation that you will publish or you will perish, I felt in some ways that I had enough knowledge of African-American religious history, African-American homiletic theory, but also a broader understanding of the role of hermeneutics, right? How do you interpret scripture in a way that's logical, in a way that's respectful of the text, the language in the text, and that is not simply reliant upon one's own ad hoc ways of developing sermon. So thinking about all of those things, some of the things I just discarded. I was not a person reared in the Reformed tradition, nor nor had I been teaching students familiar with the tradition. I knew that because of some of the training that I'd done, I would be importing things that are new to many of the students, but and I think based on a professor's shaping, some of that ought be a part of one's pedagogy. And so, again, over time, I started to back away from the long method, some of the narrative theory that just felt a bit foreign to those I was instructing. And over time, I came up with my own sort of methodology and, and received, sort of criticism along the way. This is just too hard. Why do we need to do all of this? And, I just want to, read the Bible and stand up and preach. Like, why do you have to do all of this, right? And I think in our day, I was sort of anticipating a shift in what was expected of the minister, especially as the congregation or listeners became a little more astute and sophisticated, or very much influenced by technology, so that the preacher just couldn't say whatever the preacher wanted to say. But I think my work in some ways anticipated that. Whether I had intended it to do so, it just sort of manifested in that way. And so that first book, The Journey and Promise of African-American Preaching, became an anchor text. And one of my academic mentors, Sally Brown, said, well, Kenyatta, because you're focusing on these three voices of prophet, priest, and sage, a lot of your scholarship, and perhaps most of it, will come out of that anchor. For the rest of your career, you have a well that you can draw from, and it be something that only you could write, because it is contextually specific in some ways, but it also has a universality to it that invites others to draw wisdom. And that has been, I think, an important part of my work, and probably the most gratifying, is just to know that folks can glean from one's work and not feel as if what they bring to it as a person doesn't matter. Right. Yeah, I can say more about Journey and Promise, but you probably have other questions.
I do, but while we're there, I want to at least name the two that came after. Pursuit of Justice. Do I have the title?
Yeah, right? Pursued Justice.
A Pursued Justice.
Black Preaching from the Great Migration to Civil Rights.
Yes.
Which really tied more closely to my actual dissertation research.
Okay.
So I was very interested at the time to see, how does migration actually inform clerical or homiletical identity?
Okay.
Right? What does it mean to move from the South to the North? All of this stuff was biographical. I said, man, I didn't intend for it to be that way, but to understand sort of the development of the preacher who finds her or himself in spaces that call them, and what do you do when that space is not prepared for the kind of ministry that is required of the preacher? Right? And so you had all of these migrants coming from the North, trying to make a way, new opportunities, new jobs. And the churches there were not ready for the influx of how many would come. And so how did these preachers respond? I was very interested in that. And it became very clear to me that in order for them to exercise agency and to think about what it means to preach to the masses, what it means to preach from storefront settings, in spaces where there is limited freedom, but you're still in the context of racial bigotry and hatred and violence. How do you hold on to hope and pursue justice? And so that book really has a historical accounting of how the Black preacher sort of developed phase by phase, anchored in this specific phase and a discrete period that ultimately inspired the justice preachers such as King and Proctor and Hall. All of these folks were recipients from progenitors that established a form of discourse, a sacred discourse, framing justice and hope in the Great Migration period. And we carry it forward in some ways. And so, so that, again, that book really has unfolded and developed over time. It is monographic, really written not for mass consumption, if you will, but really written for academics, and some would say even tenure, promotion.
Yes.
But I've always loved trying to connect the work that I do with the people I preach to, right? How can I be of service to the person who may or may not have a college degree, right? What can be said that will help to strengthen their own intellectual and spiritual life, but also honor what they bring to the preaching moment.
Okay. I want to shift from we've talked about your teaching, your writing. You are now dean.
I am. I'm a full semester in.
Yep. And so I want you to talk a little bit about, I know it's still fairly new, but the transition from being in the classroom all the time to a pretty significant administrative role.
Yeah, you know, it's very odd in my journey. I think when one has taught nearly 20 years, one perhaps has had several teaching positions and jobs, right? For me, that has not been the case. When I began my teaching life, it was as a fellow at Princeton. You know, I'd have a few adjunct opportunities that I'd assumed, and then when a call was made that we need someone to teach a preaching class, and I lived in Jersey, and I took a train from Union Station to get there on Fridays, and I did that for 13 weeks. I said, well, you know, this place is sort of growing on me. It's very interesting. And so step by step, you know, having sort of a sense of, I have to do scholarship here. This is a university, an R1 university. Yeah. And there's a level of expectation. I could have probably just gone there to teach and been okay. But there was something sort of pulling me toward ascending in the academy, if you will, okay. Right? I became very active in my guild. Can't believe I've been with the Academy of Homiletics for 2 decades now. I mean, this is crazy, right? But having a sense of again, you know, to whom much is given, much is required. Moving, you know, through the ranks, assistant professor, tenured, associate professor, and ultimately full professor. And quite frankly, I was pretty content with that, right? I never thought that decanal leadership would be in my path. And so when it became apparent that I needed to yield once again, just as I was reluctant to become a licensed minister, an ordained minister, this particular role came with a lot of reluctance. And I'll tell you why. I thought about initially what I'd be losing, right? I was on a pretty steady clip with my publishing, And I had a book contract. I still have a book contract. I had a contract that I wanted to work on that next book. And I was like, oh gosh, this is gonna slow my progress. Because I've never seen a dean that doesn't work, right? Or if they don't work, they won't be a dean very long. Right. But this was really a major decision for me that I now, thank God, I accepted. I really do. I think we're at a critical point in history where theological education is in crisis, right? Crisis in terms of how do we negotiate a post-COVID moment? How do we begin to utilize technology in a way that makes sense without being overly reliant on the technology that we use? How do we build community when we are learning in spaces that are remote, and particularly at a place like Howard? As a dean, I have to think about the ethos in and of itself that creates the distinctive character for a place like Howard. It's not the brick and mortar. It's not it's not really the material resources as much as it is the human resources, right? And so it has been my tradition as a critical academic to complain when things are not right.
And how's that working out now?
Well, it propels me, I think, in some ways to be a part of the solution that, I seek to see. And I think that that's really why I feel that I'm in this role. It's not something that I feel like I can master, right? I wasn't necessarily running on autopilot as a preaching professor because I would always just try to tweak. I always sort of think about what's a better way to say this, and am I actually modeling this well, and am I being challenged myself? And it was not necessarily the case that I, again, felt like I was stunting my growth, but I knew that in terms of what I wanted to see, then I needed to be a part, or at least needed to be open to the possibility that God wanted to call me into a new type of academic ministry. And leading as a dean has been very interesting. And I actually love it. I really do. I've been met with some pretty difficult challenges. I've heard you say once that because you're not a pastor doesn't mean you aren't pastoring, yes. Right? So that has been a part of sort of this first semester of my leadership. I've had a colleague to make transition unexpectedly, and not really having as firm a footing in my own role as I would have wanted to have coming into sort of the responsibilities of a dean. Finding things on social media about Howard and vandalism of an old campus, trying to think about what will I prioritize if things are just constantly bombarding me and I feel, like I'm, meeting up with challenge after challenge. Can I actually get things done, right? And so, so that has been, a steep learning curve, but it also has been one of those things where you find the creative part of yourself that establishes and understands the importance of stewarding a community's health. Mm-hmm. And I've always been concerned about whether or not students would get what I feel I received as one who trained at a seminary that had much more material resources to offer students. I'm sort of dogmatic in that way, like, okay, you're gonna come to this place, you may not have, some of the things that I've had, but in ways in which I can prepare or encourage our faculty to prepare students to acquire the same level of training and rigor that I think serve our students well, then that's what I'm pushing for. Mm-hmm. And so now, the dean's work is, fiscal responsibility, managerial, managing people, that's a challenge, right? Mm-hmm. Managing people. And also really making sure that the academic side of things prepares the student well. So you're constantly thinking about what is the student getting, and how will they do their ministry in the world, and what kind of impact will they have, and will they look back at their, whatever amount of years that they've spent and say, you know what, this place changed my life. Yeah. And that's, I think that's what I hope to see, because theological education in these times, I think it's just too important to take lightly. Why would you do ministry if you didn't care about people, if you were not serious about helping people to establish a sense of what it means to respond when God calls, right? It's not about, being financially invulnerable. It really is about trusting God along the way, and thinking about what a society needs, and how one can help persons morally, ethically, in a culture that is antithetical to working toward the flourishing of humanity in a way that is sensitive, and that mimics or follows after the footprints of Jesus.
Yeah. All right. Last question. If you were to speak to perhaps viewers who are thinking about seminary or thinking about theological education at master's or doctoral level, what would you say as a professor and as a dean?
Well, every dean would want students to come to where they're serving, okay. Right? Sure, right? Sure, so, sure. As not to be too solicitous, fair. I will just say, go where you feel called. Like, really explore what it is you're interested in, and ask yourself, what is going to prepare me to engage a world where I might be called? And if I'm not called to where I think I'm going to be called, can I have a sense of proficiency and confidence that I can make a difference? I think that that Howard is a great place because in our mission, social justice and celebrating the excellence that is part of community is sort of a given, right? You don't even question when you're going to a place like Howard, is this a school that will focus on justice? No, it's in the water, right? Is this a school that's unapologetic about its curriculum being centered on Black life and thinking about how the complexities in one's own racialized culture can feed humanity, can actually allow folks a type of entrance into beloved community that allows them to hold on to things that are distinctive to their formation, that are indigenous to how they think about their way of knowing and their way of being in the world. And so I would say that's where you go. Okay. You go where you feel sort of the affirmation and the stretching. You go where you feel like you might be in a space where you're collegially supported. You go to places that are really struggling to bring something out of you that will equip you to do God's work in the world, wherever that might be. I call that the pursuit of beloved community. It really is. It's another way of saying being drawn or invited into the kingdom of God or kingdom of God, right? Where you're establishing relationships with people. It's anti-imperialistic. It's not sort of thinking about expansionism as much as it is an invitation to follow after the man of many stripes, right? So maybe I'll leave it there.
Okay. Friend, it has been my pleasure to be with you today. Thank you so much for being here. We have spent our time today with Dean Kenyatta Gilbert, Howard University Divinity School. Again, I'm Dr. Courtney Buggs of the PhD program at Christian Theological Seminary. Thank you for joining us.